I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my trifecta talented co-host, Brett.
It's like the Olympics or something.
Well, we're talking in threes today because today is the day that you've been waiting for. 3 days of pretrial hearings in Delphi. No recordings in the courtroom. You only know what people report. But can you trust what you're reading in the news? Well, we have two people here who will tell you exactly what happened in those 3 days. They have been with you through the entire ride. They are the voice of Delphi in making sure you guys know what is happening in those courtrooms. We have Aine and Kevin from the Murder Sheet. They are literally here off 3 days of no sleep because they have been up since 4 a.m. every day to get in the courtroom to be able to report accurately to you what has happened in these hearings. Kevin, Aine, thank you guys for being here despite not sleeping for just about a week.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We always love talking with you, Brett and Alice, so thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I felt bad even asking you guys to come on to tempt you into this when really you should be like laying next to a pool somewhere resting. But we really appreciate you being here.
No place we'd rather be than talking to two of you.
Before you get into the details of what happened, talk a little bit about this whirlwind 3 days, what it was like, how long these hearings were going, because I'm used to hearings that last like a couple hours, right? But these were marathons.
We've not experienced this level. Usually it's, broken up into one day that's very intense and then you go home. But this was a lot, and it was a lot for everyone there. I mean, we were sitting so close to the victims' families, and it was a lot for them. I guess I would describe it, especially for people in the public who were showing up early in order to get seats. It wasn't as crowded as we thought it was going to be. These things always it's either a hearing that lasts 5 minutes, everyone is there, the national press is there, and then we all get kicked out and nothing happens, or it's really important and very few people are there. By the last day, there were empty seats. It was wild. But
and the hearings were very, very long. On the last day, the hearing started at 9 a.m. and it ran until 8:30 p.m., which was an extraordinary amount of time, obviously. And we can talk about maybe later some of the reasons why it went so long and whether or not all of that time was well spent.
Yes. And I would just say, there's a lot of people who go, a lot of people who care about this case. And that's nice to see, I think, people who also just want to know how the system is working and learn more. And I think that's actually really nice. I do wish there were cameras so everyone could watch along, although I do increasingly perhaps understand why there are not. But it is, I was saying to Susan Hendricks, is a journalist. She wrote a book on Delphi. It's very good. It's called Down the Hill. We were talking in line and I told her, I said, I feel like we've gone to so many hearings. You see the same faces. You almost kind of form a trauma bond with some of these people where you're kind of yeah, we're all this is a very rough process, but it's just interesting. Kind of you're meeting people that you never would meet otherwise and kind of learning more about also the Delphi community and the surrounding communities.
And to kind of set the stage, obviously, we know that trial is still currently set for October. And before any trial, there are pretrial hearings and there were motions that were filed that these hearings were set for. So can you kind of just lay out the stage of what was filed, because both sides filed pretrial motions, and what was actually being argued over these 3 days?
Well, there were, as you say, a variety of motions. Some of them involved discovery. In these cases, defense attorneys typically say, we're not getting as much material from the prosecution as we should. We're not getting it in as timely of a fashion as we should. So the defense filed some things along those lines and indicated, we want you to deliver these certain files and these certain materials by this certain date. Other things, we can't even prove they exist, but we think they exist, and you need to give them to us. And if you don't, the case should be thrown out. So that was one thing, motion to compel discovery, motion for sanctions. There is also an issue in this case that the accused man, Richard Allen, has actually made a number of confessions to the crime while he was incarcerated.
Not a number. over 60.
Over 60.
That's a conservative estimate.
That was just such a nice professional way of reporting,
like 4,
Kevin.
5. Yeah.
A myriad confessions.
Until this week, we didn't know how many, and we didn't know much about them. But one issue, obviously, was the defense doesn't want any of those to come into the trial. So they filed a motion which was argued that they should not be admitted. And then also the big one on the last day was a motion in limine. Basically, the prosecutor filed a motion saying, put up or shut up. You've been talking about this theory about Odinism. Come to court, prove that there's actually relevant material evidence connecting your theory of Odinism to the murder, and then you'd be allowed to go ahead and include it in the trial. And if you can't do that, if you can't cross that hurdle, then it should not be allowed in trial. So that was what was covered on the last day.
And then I'll add 2, I think. One was a safekeeping order, basically transferring Alan to prison rather than a jail, as would typically be the place for a pretrial detainee. Move him to Cass County, essentially. Cass County is a nearby county with a bigger jail that allows for people to be kept out of Gen Pop. So that was one thing they were asking for. And then there was also a filing about they wanted to throw out the defendant's second interview with police, basically on the grounds that Lieutenant Jerry Holman, who's one of the lead investigators of the case, is a big guy and maybe
so intimidating.
Very intimidating. May have scared Richard Allen because he's a little guy, and throw that out. So was that all?
I think so.
Did they end up withdrawing that motion? I read
they
some.
Did. They just were like, never mind. And we were like, wow, this day is going by so fast. We're going to be out of here at 2 p.m. No.
Yeah, I remember, that was a bombshell motion when it was filed. It was going to upend the entire case.
And then they just pull it. By the way, again, we've talked about this, but because there is a gag order in this case, we have seen at least the defense use filings as press releases. Really, that wasn't even argued, right? They just pulled it, which you can do as the movement.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you this. So, very general legal principles here. Typically, if someone makes incriminating statements, confessions, assuming it's not in sort of an interrogation interview, if it's in that sort of situation, then all the Miranda stuff comes in. But generally speaking, just statements that one makes, maybe to family members or fellow prisoners or just random people, all of which are relevant here. In order to suppress something like that, it's a very high bar. Basically, you have to show that it's obviously involuntary. If it's not obviously involuntary, then it would come in and you could argue the weight of the evidence. You could say, look, yeah, he said that, but he was being coerced. He was not thinking straight, like all those various things. You could bring that in, but that's stuff you put in front of a jury. To actually keep it out, you have to show something along the lines of you were insane when you said it, right? That would be an example. If you were diagnosed as insane and you confessed, we don't let the government use that confession. But it's a really high bar, and you have to show that. We got 60-something confessions here. I would think you would need to show that every one of those individually were somehow tainted in this way. Did they attempt to do that?
No.
Along those lines, because we're just learning about this, and I think people have in their mind, like, he's being tased as he's confessing. That seems like what it is. There were a couple explanations of what people heard. Can you give just a couple examples of what these confessions were like? Is he crying in a room being tased? Is he sitting in a chair being interrogated? The answer is no, right? So can you give us a little bit of a flavor of what some of these 61 confessions looked like? And I completely agree with Brett. There would be a standard for every single one of them because they weren't serial confessions, right? They didn't happen. He didn't say it 60 times in one phone call, for example. No. They happened, I think, on essentially 60 different events.
Yes.
One of them was a call to his wife. He called his wife. He wanted her to know what he had done. He wanted to explain it to her. And she hung up on him in the middle of his confession.
Let me just say this very quickly in case there's any confusion about this. You have no right to privacy in your telephone calls you make while you're incarcerated unless it is to your lawyer. So any statements you make in those, they're coming in, absent something like this.
In the recording on both ends, the line that this is what they said in court, that you are on a recorded phone line. It's not like a surprise for anybody. He knew that going into it. So I just want to emphasize The way it was described in court, the nature of the conversation was a husband going to a wife and saying, "This is what I have done. Please love me anyway." And her hanging up on him. So that is the interaction. It's not a situation where she's for some reason bullying him into, "What did you do?" He's saying, "Please know this about me, and please tell me you will be there for me and you will love me anyway." And then he does the same thing with his mother. So there are different, they talked about different types of different information that they collected around his confessions. We have audio recordings from his calls. Of course, the calls with the lawyers are not recorded, but calls with anyone else are. We have the prison guards would videotape him as he was being moved from one place to another, either going to like medical appointments or going to different places. He would freely confess during that, oftentimes in front of multiple different witnesses.
He received some mental therapy when he was in prison, and he would spontaneously offer confessions to his therapist. And she testified that she would literally tell him, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to be talking about your case with anyone who's not your attorney. And I'm here mainly to help you with how you're feeling now. I don't really need to know about what you may or may not have done." But despite receiving those admonishments from her, he continued to offer confessions to her, which she documented in reports at the time.
And then there's one other thing that I will add, because I think there's been confusion over this. Some of what we're looking at are actually written testimonials from prison guards and what they call suicide companions, who are essentially other inmates who are kind of functioning at a more trusted level in the prison, who are asked to watch over him. They were asked to watch over him in the beginning, although they switched it out to guards, in order to ensure that he did not commit suicide or acts of self-harm. So at the end of their shifts, I guess, they would write down on the log sheets, "Here's what he did, this is what he said." And so some of the things are written, but with Detective Brian Harshman, who is testifying to this, there are hours and hours. I think he said like hundreds of hours, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of hours of audio around this, in which he's and over 60 confessions. So it's pretty bad.
And a couple of things that stood out to me about those confessions, correct me if I'm wrong, oftentimes they were spontaneous, not even to someone he was talking, like someone who would pass by a jail cell. I think that was a former warden who literally passed by the cell. That stands out to me because that's not an interrogation format. It's not even a conversation they're having, like quite literally sounded like he was passing by his cell when the confession just kind of popped out. And these confessions would also happen with other people in the room. So it wasn't a secret situation where you're like huddled in a corner, like, "I have to unburden myself. Let me tell you something." It was almost like, I want the world to know. Everyone around can hear, even if the message was not intended for them. I think this is important for people to hear because of all the allegations of him, of why you want to keep these out. It seems like there are so many different instances in which he's confessing. Was there any indication of the timeline? Like, was this over a course of a year? Yeah, please. What was the timeline of all of these confessions?
So it goes back a little earlier, but the important date you have to remember is March 21st, 2023. So what happened on that day? Well, that was the day that Richard Allen let Jesus Christ into his life. And so shortly after that, early April, essentially, he's going on this campaign of telling everyone and attempting to work it out, because what he told people was that he was scared that he was not going to see his family again in this lifetime, but if perhaps he atoned for his sins, he would see them all again in heaven. And so he was trying to unburden his soul and do the right thing, essentially. And although when his family started essentially telling him to shut up and stop communicating with him as a result of all this, then he sort of went into a period of despair and indicated that he felt that he had to choose his family over God. That's how he phrased it. But let's go back a little earlier. November 2022, right after he's arrested, he's on a phone call with his wife, Kathy, and he says to her something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, "If you want this all to be over, I can just go to the detectives and tell them everything I know." Presumably she said no.
I don't feel sorry for Richard Allen, particularly given what he did. But it is remarkable how evident it is that he wants to confess, plead, and end this. I mean, it just screams out that that's what he wants to do. Or at least that's what he wanted to do back in March.
He was in the courtroom, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so this might be what you're getting at, but a lot of these hearings have been I think not. They've been in the judge's chambers. Here we have Richard Allen hearing everything. Obviously, they're arguing that he's coerced or not in his right mind to be able to make these confessions, but he's hearing everything that's happening in these marathon 3-day hearings. Was it ever said by the judge or by anyone in the courtroom, like, you can confess? It's called pleading guilty. I mean, I just don't, I do not trust that he has gotten that message before. And when you are not being advised in a certain way, you as the layperson may not actually know what your avenues are.
I want to tell you, frankly, that is something I am very, very concerned about, because his behavior screams that he wants this process to end. Why is it still going on? I don't understand it.
And I'll tell you this, I think it's very possible that essentially the rejection he felt from his wife and mother over this pushed him back to the other side, where it was like, no, I am innocent, please love me again. And I think that is possible. It's possible he changed his mind, which is of course allowed to do. But at the same time, I also think it's possible that he may be getting some bad information that there's not that much of a case against you. Just hold the line and we'll get you out. And that is very much been decreased by his own actions at this point.
I'm very concerned about that as well. On an earlier episode of our program, we were able to share some messages sent back and forth from people very closely linked to the defense team. And they quoted the investigator for the defense team as saying, the prosecution has nothing. They have absolutely no case whatsoever. And if the family of Mr. Allen is getting that message, and if they are not legally sophisticated people, and if they're believing that, they may be encouraging him to fight because they're not getting an accurate picture of what's actually happening.
But I'm going to say this. These lawyers do not work for Kathy and Janice Allen. They work for Richard Allen. What he wants is supposed to be paramount. His rights are supposed to be the ones, and he has a right to not be dragged through trial where all of these images of what he's alleged to have done are going to be put up and discussed at length. And I can tell you, when they bring up the girls in court, when they talk about these 2 teenage girls that he is alleged to have kidnapped and slaughtered in the woods, he is like much more agitated. You could see in the kind of like he's twitching. He's always looking up and doing all this stuff. At times he kind of like turns and glares at people. I know some people who are sitting over towards the families of the victims talked about that he was glaring in their direction at some point. And it's one of those things where he's obviously, this is not a person who is relaxed and feeling okay. I mean, again, and if he is guilty, then I don't feel bad for him. But I can also understand why someone would say, well, I just don't want to have to go through this. I want to tell everyone what I did and just accept whatever the consequences are. So I just think the whole thing is very concerning that they're dragging this guy potentially through this process.
This has only happened once to me in my entire career, but something similar was happening, and it was only a supervised release violation. So very, very different. This guy was looking at like coming back to serve 6 more months in jail, but he was just spewing things in court and like perjuring himself nonstop, and his attorney could not stop him. And I finally kind of just stood up and addressed the judge, but it was a message for the client, for the defendant. And I said, Your Honor, I know that there have been many outbursts, and he's like literally still jumping up and screaming things. And I was like, as everyone in this courtroom knows, anyone has the right to admit to any violation here. And I sit down and he goes, What? And he admitted it. I mean, it was either that his attorney couldn't get through to him or his attorney wasn't advising him. But I spoke to the judge, because you're never supposed to speak to the other side. But I was like, something is going on here. We're talking about it was a minor infraction. It was not the rest of his life. It was not a big deal. And he was going to get himself in more trouble because of what he was doing. And I could just see this cliff he was going off of, and his attorney was doing nothing. And I just spoke to the judge, and the judge looked at me, knew what I was doing. And then it all ended much better for him, right? He could admit to that violation as opposed to perjuring himself and possibly bringing new charges for lots of other things. And I almost wish someone would stand up in this courtroom and just make sure he has heard those words before, because I am not convinced that he actually knows that. What he hears is, doesn't matter what I've said. It can be kept out as coercion. We're going to throw out every other time, every other police thing. And there's all these other potential people. I'm not necessarily lying, because as long as there's reasonable doubt and someone else is responsible, then the jury has spoken. It's not me, right? There's so much you can see that I'm not the one actively lying or not unburdening my soul. I'm afraid that's the message he's getting from these hearings, from these experts, quote unquote, that we'll get into, and from the filings. Because if you read all that, a layperson can be very confused. In fact, a lot of the internet has been confused about what's going on in this case, which is why your reporting is so important.
See, unlike Alice, who is so biased against these defense attorneys, obviously, I am going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, my hope is, and obviously we've got more to talk about, my hope is these hearings are really important because big things are going to be decided after these hearings. The admissibility of these confessions, the third-party defense, which, by the way, Legal Briefs, episode 99, if you want to know more about that, the judge is going to make decisions. I think I'm going to go out on a limb. It's a real thin one and say that the confessions will not be suppressed and there will be at least some limitation on the third-party defense. And once that happens, a good attorney, good defense attorneys would sit down with their client and say, look, we've lost all the legal things. Now it's presenting a case to a jury, and we have no case. And they have a great one. And the best thing they've got are your words. Let me read you everything you've said. Confessions that aren't just, I did it, but include details from the case, that are from multiple people, that are on recordings. That's a difficult situation. And I would hope that at that point, his defense attorneys would have that serious conversation. You guys know these defense attorneys better than we do. Do you think there's any hope that that would happen once the judge does decide on these issues?
I think there's more hope now than there was a number of months ago. I've been really baffled by a lot of strategic decisions that this team has made. So I tend to be a little bit more like whatever the kind of thing that is unexpected, they'll pick that over maybe what would be perhaps considered the more logical, effective path.
I'd like to say something about the quality of lawyering we're seeing in these hearings about these defense attorneys. And what I'm going to mention is something that's relatively small. I don't think it got a lot of attention because certainly there were more dramatic examples of problems for the defense in these hearings. But one of their motions, as we mentioned, was a motion to compel. In other words, there's discovery materials you should have given us that you haven't given us. They mentioned some specific things. And the prosecutor over lunch.
Can I just say, I was standing out in the hallway. I didn't go to lunch with everybody because I just felt sick. These hearings really just bother me on some innate level. So like the first day I'm usually just like, but I'm sitting there and I see Nicholas McClelland, who's the prosecutor, like run down the stairs. And I was like, okay. And then I saw one of the detectives go into where he had gone into. And I was like, okay, what's going on here?
What he's doing is he is going to his records and he is producing a receipt, a literal receipt that the defense signed indicating that they had received earlier the very same things that they are now saying we haven't received. And that is such an embarrassing error, but it really does say something about the quality of legal work Mr. Allen is receiving in this case.
I think
what happened when they were presented with the receipt? Did they did they act like they forgot and withdraw, or how did they respond to that? I think that is also very telling.
Jennifer Auger, who was the attorney handling that part of it, she's the newest member of the team, but she got up and she said, I'm probably going to misquote her, but I'm paraphrasing. It was something to the extent of like, oh, well, that was very kind of Nicholas McClelland to like find for us. And it was like, I was dying of embarrassment. I don't know if anyone else got that, but that is just like you figure out what went wrong before you do that, or it just blows up in your face and you look totally incompetent. And I'm just going to say this, like, I like to use a stupid historical analogy, which I want to do. I feel like this is like if the Titanic happened at this point, but instead of being like, oh no, we hit an iceberg, they're just like, let's go. We can still make New York. Let's do it. And it's like, that's been the vibe coming from this whole thing. And maybe what happened for these last 3 days is a wake up call, or maybe I'm reading it differently. And maybe they just wanted to throw everything at this that they could. And then it's like, well, we tried. But I just don't know. It doesn't seem like there's like that much of a kind of a comprehensive plan here. It seems like just reactions happening again and again.
And let me ask you about that, because just going back to this legal question, because I just keep thinking about the law here. I know that's crazy, but
Wow, what?
they've got these they've got these confessions and thinking about ways to keep it out. I mean, one obvious way, probably the only way, frankly, is to say, he's insane. And I know there's been talk about like, the prison drove him insane or whatever, or his guilt might have driven him insane. Who knows? But he was crazy. Was there any, they got $40,000 for experts. Did they bring in an expert to talk about mental health?
Evaluation?
Mental evaluation,
not literally
a
okay,
competency.
So I know, like you guys can't see it maybe, but Anya's like literally face palming with all the hands that she can find in the room. In any other situation, the very first thing you do is you usually file something with the court. I'm letting everyone know, like it's a very clear path. You're like, I suspect, judge, that there is mental incompetence, insanity, something. I'm going to ask to have an evaluation. You have the evaluation, you submit that evaluation to the court, and then both sides get to read it and decide what to do. They can implement that at any time. And it is something that needs to be done by the defense because the defense knows the person. The prosecution typically is not the one to invoke it. So they haven't invoked it here at all, right? They've invoked it generally, but they have not asked for a mental competency evaluation, and they have not retained anyone for an evaluation submitted to the court. Is that correct?
That
and
is
nobody
correct.
stops them from doing that. I'm not saying, I know that they have said he's under duress, the Odinist guards are whatever, but that is very different from the legal procedure of alleging and finding out whether there is any sort of mental issue for purposes of suppressing these confessions. So that's not happened in this case, right?
No. And let me tell you, they did actually have an expert talk about his psychotic or, allegedly psychotic episodes, what were believed to possibly be psychotic, although it sounds like a lot of people also thought he may have been malingering. Including this expert. But let's just talk about this expert for a minute. Okay, so this is a woman named Dr. Monica Walla. She is a psychologist up at Westville, and she treated Alan. She treated him extensively. Brad Rosie, one of the attorneys, the defense attorneys, he puts her on the stand and does a direct examination. And the first maybe half of it, would you say? It's all good vibes. Everyone's friends here. She is, this sympathetic psychologist who took care of Alan and really kind of got to know him and really worked to help him. And look, she's saying she thought he might have been psychotic at times, and that's in her notes. And she went into that and, why it might be psychotic, why he had, serious depression issues going in and how that might affect somebody. So she's like the defense's best friend right now. She is just building this whole case for maybe he has some mental health issues. And that.
But here comes the twist. At some point, he begins confessing to her. And so then it's no longer in their interest for her to be seen as this paragon of doctors. And so at that point, there is a twist. And suddenly they talk about how awful she is. She doesn't follow proper procedures, blah, blah,
this
blah.
This is all while she's still on the stand? Like, it's is this the arc of her testimony on the stand?
We went through a whole breakup here. I mean, this was like a soap opera, like it was like, oh, we love each other now. No, you're the worst. It was, and
there was a 10-minute break. And
I'm so confused. Did something happen in those 10 minutes? Because usually you have an outline. You know where you're going.
No, nothing happened. We did not see any screaming matches in the hallway. I believe this was the plan. And it's kind of bizarre because I actually thought this was an area where Rosie did a pretty good job in both separate instances. He did an amazing job breaking her down. He also did an amazing job building her up. But it's like, because it's the same person, it becomes very ineffective because it just looks like you don't know what to think. Like, okay, so we totally trust her when she says that she thought he might be psychotic. That is locked in. Her word is God on that. But, it turns out she had been part of a number of Facebook groups that I will not mention, but she was interested in the case and may have made a post about here's some shows I recommend. And I don't think any of us were on there, that, by the way, just so everyone knows. But the thing is, so she had that interest and they were saying that that's unethical and inappropriate. And I don't really know the mental health field so well to like be condemning or excusing that. I want to talk to some people about that and see like what they think. But anyways, just from a legal, like how you do direct examination, it was very confusing.
I will quickly say this, as Anya mentioned that she was a fan of certain programs that cover the case. She tended to favor the programs that take the view that Richard Allen was innocent. And so she would communicate to him about some of the contents of the things she was seeing.
People support you. People love you. People are on your side. Don't despair. You have fans now. So that was some of the stuff she was bringing back to him.
And then he confessed to her?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, you can do it. Oh, hey, but I did it.
It's like, actually, now that you mention it, wow. Well, okay. What is...
There's so much to unpack there.
And we just barely begun.
I know. What is their argument for the 60-plus confessions not coming in?
Did they make an argument?
Yeah, they did.
They did. It was kind of two-pronged. They said that a number of people, including Dr. Walla, were essentially state actors. So that means that he was under interrogation. That doesn't necessarily cover, obviously, the family. And so they also brought up the claim that the condition...
You can confess to state actors. I'm a little confused with that. I'm saying this out loud for everyone out there. You're allowed to confess to whoever you want. There's no, like, state actor exemption like there is to maybe like a priest.
But the implication is that they were state actors who were deliberately trying to get him to confess. So they were doing basically custodial interrogations without giving him his Miranda rights. And Dr. Wallace said, I told him not to talk about the crime, and I was just trying to provide therapy. And other people are just walking by his cell when he's...
like those interrogators do, just passing by without interacting with someone when they start screaming at you.
None of this, to be clear, other than him talking to his therapist, none of this is the result of an interrogation, a questioning session, however you want to call it.
None of this is a result of an interrogation. So
Did they actually bring up Miranda? I'm just curious.
No.
Are they really make? Oh, okay. So that, and I say that, Kevin, because I know how smart you are, and I was like, I think that's Kevin making the argument for them, because I didn't believe that their argument was as good as you were saying. When you said Miranda just now, I literally said, I bet they didn't argue that.
They used the term custodial interrogation. That these were basically
correct.
Custodial interrogation.
I just want everyone to know Kevin's a really good attorney because he made that argument, and I was like, there's no way they made that argument.
Thank you.
I mean, let me say this. So typically where this comes up would be like the police are surveilling a hotel room and they tell the cleaning lady, hey, when you go in there to clean the room, search it for us and see if you find any drugs. Okay. That person would then be a state actor, even though they're not a police, because they're acting under the direction of the police to investigate a crime. So unless they can show that the inmates, the warden, the people walking by were directed by the police to go in and get this confession, that's not going to work. Was there any evidence that these people were directed to go get a confession from him?
No.
None whatsoever.
And actually, in one situation, the former warden, John Gallipo, talked about how he got a letter from Alan, basically what he said, saying, hey, I'd like to confess to you. Come on by. And he handed that over to IA. So there would be a chain, so internal affairs for the prison. So there'd be a chain of custody, and declined to go there because he didn't want to essentially be responsible for, participating in what could be called an interrogation letter. And I will say this, the other element of this argument is that the environment in the prison was so coercive that it's basically like he was being tortured. And I will tell you, we've interviewed inmates at Westville who spent time in the MCU, the sort of this high security place where he was. And it's often, people who got in trouble or who are in some sort of protective custody. It's like, it's or their behavior is so severe that they just need to be there. And it is a very harsh environment I don't want to downplay that. It's absolutely fair to say that I think these settings would really take a toll on anyone's mental health. Obviously, it wouldn't put into your mind details of a crime that you didn't commit, but it is a very intense environment. So I think what we've learned about Westville is that it is very harsh, like most prisons, I would probably argue. But it's definitely one of the tougher ones in Indiana, I would say.
And we say this all the time. I mean, prisons are tough places. Certainly maximum security units within a prison are going to be tough places because of the people that they're having to maintain, right? But I think this is really interesting because I didn't get this from any of the reporting, what the argument actually was to suppress the confessions. And it sounds like it's all muddled, right? There are actual arguments you can make that it's a custodial. By the way, I think this all goes really more to the weight. But then when you kind of mar it with it was such an oppressive situation, that doesn't have to do with custodial. That is just, I would say, mental health generally, which then kind of goes to whether it's admissible for mental health reasons, or maybe it's to the weight of the evidence, because maybe in order to be able to join the right gang so you're not shivved by someone else, you have to trade some sort of stuff. And so it's so coercive that I'm going to tell you I'm this hardened child killer so that I'll be at the top of the food chain. What is the argument? There are arguments to be made, but the blurring of all of them, and I assume there wasn't much citation to the law, makes it seem like a weaker argument. And if you were going to do that, this is what I would do. I would make a chart of the 61 confessions and put them into categories. These should all be cut out because they're custodial interviews in which he was supposed to be Mirandized. These were all because he was clearly lying because he wanted to trade for reputational purposes, for safety within the prison or whatever. And these were because he was literally in the mental break. And we know that because the doctor upped his medication at this time, X, Y, and Z. That is the way you go about suppressing confessions. In this way, it was literally just like, oh, we have really bad facts. Better keep them all out. Note that is not how you suppress confessions. There are actual ways to do this. And I say this because we have lots of people who confess. And the first thing their attorneys are going to do is try to keep them out. And sometimes they are successful. But these guys know how to do this. But there aren't real arguments to be made, I think, based on what I'm hearing, that it makes it really difficult to be able to segment out. And he seems to be confessing continuously. So that count might be going up as well. I mean, I lay that all out because I wasn't in that hearing. Did anything like that happen?
Nothing like that happened, but it won't surprise you to hear that the member of the prosecution team who handled this element is a woman named Stacey Diener, and she made basically the point you made. She said, you can't make a general comment. You have to make these arguments specifically. If there is a particular confession where someone was acting on behalf of the state and doing so improperly and he wasn't getting his rights or what have you, then we can talk about that, and maybe that one gets tossed out. But you can't just say something applies to everything. Let's get into specifics. And the defense was not willing or prepared to do that.
And let me just say, Alice, what you just did right there is a very uncanny thing, because every time we talk to a lawyer about this whole situation and give them sort of an outline of what's happening, and we talk to a lot of lawyers in Indiana just to kind of have a sense behind the scenes. They'll never be on the show, but they're just people who we kind of like bounce ideas off of. A lot of defense attorneys as well. And the thing that everyone does is kind of come up, here's how I would do it. And it always sounds a lot more like legally grounded and sensible than what ends up actually happening. It's just, like, I've heard closing arguments essentially like thrown together in like 5 minutes that I was like, that actually sounds pretty compelling. Or like, here's how I would get this out. And I'm like, but like every time they have the opportunity to do something, I feel that like would make a lot of sense, they pick the option. I mean, look at Odinism. They picked Odinism. There's other suspects that have come up, and they picked Odinism. They picked a religious cult operating in the woods. Oh, can we put any of these guys at the scene? No, but the press will love it. Everything's for the press. Everything's for the public. Everything's frankly for the internet cranks. And it's not a winning strategy.
And on that, I think this was the part that really gripped everyone, is the some other guy did it defense. And my understanding is the prosecution filed motions in limine, which just means we're going to deal with this ahead of trial so that the jury doesn't have to sit through a bunch of sidebars, right? Essentially saying you don't get to bring in Odinism, and then specifically individuals who may have been subject of investigations at some point, that you can't bring them in without evidence tying them to this crime. You can't just generally allege like Bigfoot did it. I'm going to do that. And so this was the last day of the hearing. Is that right? This is day 3?
Yes.
So I think this is fascinating. A lot obviously happened this day. Can you lay out for us, how this started, how it was presented, and also what are all the things that the prosecution is trying to make sure is kept out if there's no evidence tying it to this case?
Where that portion of the day began with one of the attorneys for the defense, Andrew Baldwin, making, frankly, a ridiculously long opening statement in which he talked in great detail about the witnesses he was going to present and the things they would say connecting the case to Odinism. This goes on for about 45 minutes, and at the end of it, he says, of course, all these things I'm talking about, we don't actually have to prove any of them. We just have to suggest they're possible, and that should be enough for them to come into the trial. And then at that point, the prosecutor, Nicholas McClelland, stands up and says, no, that's not the law. Actually, the law is you need to produce direct material evidence tying these specific people to the crime, or it doesn't come in. And he made that point very forcefully. He was in incredible form that day.
Yeah.
And so then the next thing was the defense produced their so-called expert witness, who I think was just trying to suggest that, well, it's possible when you look at the crime scene that there's elements of ritual murder there.
Yeah.
How do you want to talk about this witness?
I don't want to talk about her anymore. I feel like I went on a complete rant on our show, and it's because this was one of those things. 5 minutes in, I was just like, did I somehow get drugged? Like, am I just losing my mind from lack of sleep? Is this woman saying these things? Is this what her actual basis is? And frankly, this woman, Dawn Perlmutter,
she's an art history.
Her background is in art history, but for some reason she's part of some forensic program. And, her big thing is, she has a methodology, and the methodology is very important. The methodology seems to be that, if you pay her to look at different symbols, then she will find the symbols for you in a crime scene and come back and tell you what you want to hear. That's pretty much what I got out of it.
She was saying things like this murder happened outside.
Oh.
And murders that happen outside, probably ritualistic.
Probably might be. And you know what? A knife might be ritualistic. And then they're saying the cross-examination. I was like dying of like secondhand embarrassment. I was just like in my seat. Like, it's like, I don't want to see this. Like, this is, like just dismantling everything she said. She's basically like, it's some like overly academic nonsense that has no business being in a courtroom. And let me just say this. This was one thing that came out. This defense team asked her to be part of this officially in April of this year. And around that time, we reported this later on, but we reported that they were basically desperately calling everyone they could think of to come put them on the stand to be their Odinist expert.
And remember, this time the trial was scheduled for just a few weeks later.
So this was one of those people who got that last minute call and decided, sure, I can be a warm body who will tell you what you pay me to tell you. That's fine. And got up there. But like, explain what also came out about what her public statements were prior.
Well, I think I said this on our podcast. When Nicholas McClelland began his cross-examination, well, basically, his cross-examination of this woman was the most devastating cross-examination I've ever seen, and I'm including cross-examinations I've seen Perry Mason do on television. He totally tore this expert apart. He said, well, would you agree that it is important to actually look at the evidence before you come to a conclusion? And she said, yes. And he said, well, when did you become a part of this team and start looking at these things? It was in April of 2024. And he said, well, isn't it interesting? You were on court TV in September of 2023, months before you saw any of this evidence. And at that time, you said it was definitely a ritualistic murder.
It's almost like she sees ritual murders everywhere. Also,
and she based it at that time solely on material she read in a motion that was filed by the defense. And he said, well, you make some money doing consulting, right? She said, yes. And he said, well, it would probably look bad if you said something on TV in September and then changed your mind a few months later. And so isn't it possible that might be affecting your testimony here today?
And let me just say, I'm sorry, this thing she revealed, and this was the most important thing from her testimony. In this portion of things, it was revealed that the behavioral analysis unit from the FBI took a look at this crime scene and found that they did not believe it was a ritual homicide. They did not believe that the sticks on the bodies were runes. They believed that it was essentially undoing. So the sticks were put on top of the girls because the killer essentially was like, I can't deal with what I've done. And it's a removal psychologically, if you cover someone with a blanket or something like that, it's like, it's almost like it didn't happen. And so,
but the defense previously asserted that the BAU did look at this and confirmed it was Odinism. Or was that only on the internet? I can't remember. Honestly, I can't remember the divide.
I will tell you the answer to that, and it's very, very interesting. That is something that was mentioned in their first Franks filing. And in that filing, the defense chose their words extremely carefully. They said that we got this letter from this police investigator named Todd Click, and in his letter, he told us that the BAU said it was Odinism. So the defense themselves never asserted that the BAU said that. They said that Todd Click, this investigator, said
and
that.
They relied on the rest of us being like, well, what attorney would put that in a letter and not follow that up with an actual BAU confirmation?
But likely at that time, they knew that the BAU did not conclude that. So that's why they didn't assert that. They were just accurately asserting that, oh, here's a guy who said that they did.
And you know what? When I'm looking at something like this, first of all, ritual murder involving Odinism is not a common thing. Odinists are a violent prison gang. There have been Odinist murders linked to, there was a DJ who was critical of the Odinists and the white nationalists out in Colorado. He was murdered. It wasn't a ritual. It was an assassination. And one thing that she had to admit was like, have you heard of a lot of murders involving Odinists ritually sacrificing white children if they're white nationalists? Is that something that typically happens? And she had to admit, no. Also, the one case she's been involved in with Odinism, you can't make this up. The one case where there were Odinist hallmarks, in her opinion, is open. It's an open case. So that's just her theory that she brought into that case as well. I mean, I'm sorry. I was like, they've had months and months and months to put something together here. And this is their expert. This is what they found. I'm going to tell you, we know that Todd Click and two other investigators developed this theory at first. And they put together information and they ran it down and they didn't get anywhere. They didn't get to probable cause, but they did their jobs. They looked into it. And these defense attorneys have not expanded upon that body of work in any perceivable way as far as I'm concerned. They're just running with that, but frankly, adding even more outlandish elements that they cannot back up. And so I feel like we saw the Odinist theory just collapse under itself on that last day.
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple things that immediately spring to mind. The first is, it seems like you have some officers who looked into something and decided it wasn't viable and moved on. Where ordinarily the criticism of the police is tunnel vision. Their first thought is what they hold on to. But these guys moved on from it, and somehow that's the issue. Like they should have stuck to the Odinist thing. The other thing, you must be mistaken, because I understand that these guys were ready to go to trial. They were ready to file a speedy trial act motion right before they were removed by the judge last year. So they had to have had an expert available for Odinism because that was their defense, right? So you must be getting those months wrong, because surely that wasn't a lie that was told to all of us here in the public.
I'm going to tell you this. So the expert that they so frequently touted before all of this essentially had to come in a filing from the prosecution and say, what they are saying about what I said is incorrect. They were making this Dr. Jeffrey Turco out to be their biggest fan. Yeah, man, they're definitely runes. That's what it is. You guys are totally right. I mean, they weren't literally quoting him on saying that, but that was what they were putting out there. They picked out these sentences where it's like, look, he's saying that we were right. The state police are the ones who are lying. Lieutenant Jerry Holman minced his words and misrepresented this doctor. And then Turco had to come out and say, like, no, the state police got it right. These guys are completely cherry picking what I said. And if you've ever talked to an academic, like they're nuanced. They're like, well, it could be this, but it also probably isn't. And they were basically doing the equivalent of like, well, it could be this, and then chopping off the rest of the sentence. And I mean, that was their guy. I mean, he made it clear that maybe liars is too an extreme a word, but he essentially called them out on that in that filing. And then they were scrambling. I mentioned they were calling Lauren Crow, who's awesome. She's the president of the Troth. It's a very inclusive, pro-LGBT, very open group of heathens. And so it's like the same Norse gods that the Odinists and the Asatru worship, but it's different because they're not racist. And, she was getting calls. And like we actually played a voicemail from Baldwin on our show where he's just like, yeah, like, you want to come join the team? Like, it's like, oh my God. She declined.
I mean, with that, trial is currently still set for October. We have said before that we would be surprised if the defense didn't try to move the trial because it does not seem like they are ready with these 3 days of hearings. And it sounds like their witnesses were truly crumbling in the light of day. Were there any overtures by them? And that's what the motion to compel was, right? The motion to compel is essentially to say, well, the evidence is so disorganized. We're not getting the evidence we need. We've always hypothesized that's then a segue to say, it's not our fault. We want speedy trial, but because it's the prosecution's fault, we can't go. Were there any overtures to moving the trial in October?
No.
As a matter of fact, at the beginning of, I believe, the first hearing, Judge Gull, perhaps sensing that sort of possibility, she made a point of saying, jury questionnaires are being printed. They're about to be mailed out, and the people will be receiving them sometime in the middle of next week.
Godspeed, Allen County. It's one of those things where, though, I think they're going to try to move it back. Honestly,
okay.
Again,
I just didn't know if they were going to use this hearing to try and lay the groundwork, but it sounds like they did not.
They did not. And I will say this, though. Like in a normal world, after what we just saw, the implosion that we just saw, we would be expecting a plea deal or some sort of guilty plea, like some sort of like attempt to work something out.
I just want to very quickly mention the implosion. Brett mentioned that there was investigators who were working on this theory, and a couple of them testified about their investigation. And then when prosecutor Nick McClelland stood up in his cross-examination, he'd always make a point of asking them, were you ever able, despite all of your hard work, to directly connect these people to this crime? And the investigators would have to say no. And they said, were you even able to establish if these people were even in Delphi, even on the day of the murders? And the investigators had to say no. So it seems pretty clear that they did not reach the standard of directly tying them to this crime with material evidence.
Yeah, and also I get the sense with these investigators, Kevin Murphy and Todd Click, there may be some lingering feelings like, oh, well, we had a really bad feeling about those guys that we looked into. So maybe we just didn't get there. And I understand that. I think when you kind of get in an investigation like that and you're the one looking in at a certain group, it's human to be like, this is very important. And I'm kind of like, I'm the expert on this. And I put all these connections together and it feels like there's something there. But that doesn't matter. We're not trying people based on vibes. We're trying people based on like who's can we put here, who has confessed to it, what does the forensic evidence say, what does the bullet say, and that's what's important. And these investigators acknowledge that they didn't put a case together. They were not able to get to probable cause here, and they were not able to get to even anything remotely close to what you need for a trial. They were able to put together that these guys, these Odinists or alleged Odinists, probably have some pretty weird connections with some bad groups like the Vinlanders. And maybe like have said or done weird stuff.
But that doesn't make them murderers.
That does not a child murderer make. And so I just, ugh.
This is so interesting because I know the allegations are going to be, because they always are, poor police work and whatnot. What I'm hearing, this is very frustrating because, of course, the purpose of this is to try and tie the evidence so that they can bring in the some other guy did it defense, the some other, cult did it defense. It's incredible, actually, to be hearing about all the investigative leads that you normally would not hear about within a case because you only typically focus on what the investigation ultimately ended up, leading to the charges at issue. Here, we're actually getting a view into the entire investigative file, and it's pretty fulsome, to be completely honest. And to even read that they're looking at ritualistic killings and having such a wide variety of what I would think really outside of the box type of investigative leads. I haven't seen the entire case file. I don't know what else is in there, but we are kind of getting a unique view that we normally do not get into a prosecution of the extensive work that never would have made it into this trial, but for what the defense is trying to insert here. And I note this because pretty soon they're going to change tactics, or they've already done this, that the police did nothing, that they are lazy. And they've already said this in this hearing as well, I think, is that, they're falling down on their job. And I just want to flip that for the people who are hearing this. You're hearing massive amounts of investigation that you normally wouldn't hear in this trial. And if I were leading this investigation in the front end, I'm not sure we'd have enough resources to actually look at all these leads that didn't seem like they were promising. And it sounds like despite not being promising, they still pursued them kind of for longer than you normally would.
Yes, they did.
They pursued them vigorously. One of the investigators said he spoke to the prosecutor at the time, and the prosecutor told him, if you think this lead has legs, run with it.
Yeah, no one was saying, don't look at the Odinist. No reason why, but just
uncover the massive conspiracy that goes all the way to the top.
Yeah, everyone's wearing Viking hats. It's just it's a Norse pagan mafia situation going on here. But here's the thing, like, I think a lot of leads were looked into vigorously. When we came into the case, we started reporting on the whole Kagan-Klein angle, which came up. Yeah.
That was another potential suspect they wanted to talk about.
Yeah,
let's talk about that for a second.
Well, first of all,
because look, under the law, I mean, maybe if Judge Gold really hates them, she'll let them do the Odinist thing so they can embarrass themselves in court. But under the law, that shouldn't come in. But these other suspects are more interesting to me. The Kagan-Klein, the Ron Clay, like that's what. How was their presentation on those alternative suspects?
I thought their presentation on Kagan-Klein, which was done by Brad Rosie, was very well done, and it was like a glimpse into an alternate universe where they'd focused on that originally.
Yeah, this is Earth 2 defense team, because like you were like, wow, this actually makes some sense what you're saying.
He got an investigator to discuss the extent of the investigation into Kagan-Klein, including the fact that just weeks before the arrest of Richard Allen, there was a massive search of the Wabash River that came about because Kagan-Klein told police a story that he and his father had thrown incriminating materials out of the window of their red Jeep as they were driving home from Delphi on the day of the murders. And also, even after the arrest of Richard Allen, police still believe that Kagan-Klein could have been involved, and they brought that out by suggesting that the police were trying very hard to establish a link between,
or at least rule it out, right? And
they were looking for a link.
They were looking for a link, and so
that suggests that at least the police, who presumably know more about the case than anybody, even at that late date, they thought there was a possibility there was evidence connecting Kagan.
And did it come out, or has it come out? Or has it ever been confirmed that Kagan-Klein was in communication with the girls?
No, they confirmed
it. So that is confirmed.
100%. They confirmed it at this hearing. I'm not going to lie, Brett. I mean, we were there, and I'm a little petty. Over the years, we broke all of that news, like the red Jeep, the river search, the fact that they were looking into both Kagan-Klein and his father, Tony Klein's violent, abusive tendencies. And for years, people have been like, they just made that up, they're just just saying whatever.
And it was all confirmed.
And it was like, Brad Rosie, welcome to the murder sheet. Like, I mean, he just confirmed like the third murder sheet. I mean, I was shocked. I did not think they were going to get into that level of detail. But here's the problem with Kagan as a suspect. First of all, it's Kagan and his father, Tony, who were being looked at. And this, again, was confirmed there. And what Vito, the detective, said was interesting was they were looking at it where like both Kagan and his father could have had access to the same account. But here's the problem. First of all, Kagan is too large to be Bridge Guy. He does not look like Bridge Guy, and even back then. And then Tony Klein, he has a higher voice than you would think. He doesn't sound like Bridge Guy. So those are problems. But let's even look past that. On the day of the murders, both of their phones were on and in use in their home in Peru, Indiana.
And this was brought out in court.
That's a big problem, in my opinion. Another problem is Kagan, through his attorney, he had a whole meeting. He basically brought this whole task force together at Gus Grissom Air Force Base and said, here's what happened. My dad and I drove to the cemetery in Delphi. He got out, came back all bloody. All this stuff happened. And so I want to confess to you. So then he gets into a car with Lieutenant Jerry Holman. They drive to Delphi.
And they take the route that Kagan-Klein says he took on that day. And the police are subsequently able to go and look at businesses around the area and get camera footage that shows traffic on those roads at that particular time that Kagan said he was driving. And in fact, they look at all of the traffic on the road that day, and none of it shows a red Jeep.
There's no red Jeep. So he's lying, and his phone shows him at home that day in use. It's not just like lying there, someone's using it. So he's ultimately, I understand why they looked at him so hard. I think that's completely legitimate as far as leads go. But I mean, I think he would have been a better suspect for the defense to focus on, frankly.
But I wouldn't be surprised if Judge Cole allows that in.
Yeah.
The other person, of course, is Ron Logan. He is the owner of the property where the girls were discovered.
That went nowhere.
The defense basically...
And he's since passed away, right?
He's dead, yeah.
He's since passed away of COVID a few years back. Jennifer O'Jay, who's the third member of the defense team, she literally stood up and said something to the extent of, let's talk about Ron Logan for a few minutes.
Ron Logan, folks.
And she admitted into evidence a search warrant for Ron Logan's property, which was issued just a few days after the murders, or I guess a few weeks after the murders, which spelled out the evidence at that time. And she wanted the court to look at that. And that was literally the entire presentation.
So they were much more comprehensive on the Klein angle. And it's interesting. They mentioned that it was an extensive attempt to see if there was any link between Klein and Allen. And some people do believe, like some people have said in the local area that they likely knew each other. But there's been no digital evidence, no proof connecting them. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of evidence there in case people were wondering.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting from a legal perspective because there is a standard for allowing this kind of information in. As you said, there are rules of evidence. We don't just let any evidence come in. That's why we have trials. We don't debate about this on Twitter. We actually try these cases. And the Odinism stuff is just so speculative, and it is so it's not anchored to reality in any way. It's disturbing to me to see the satanic panic stuff come back. I mean, that is, if they let the Odinism stuff in and it takes off, that's going to hurt a lot of people. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to end up in the crosshairs of that kind of thing. It's not going to be pretty. It wasn't pretty last time it happened. But having said all that, the Kagan Klein stuff is a much stronger argument.
Like the actual communications with the girls.
The confession. I mean,
the confession, even if it's a lie. In fact, I would use that to my defense. Everybody confesses. Doesn't mean you did it. Maybe they're saying he confessed he didn't do it. My guy confessed he didn't do it. There's lots of things that you could argue there. It's very interesting they don't lean harder into the Klein thing because there will be people who, if they can get this testimony in, generally are going to say, I don't care what you say. If he was in communication with the girls, that's done. That's reasonable doubt for me. There will be people who think that, right? So I think that is a much stronger tie for letting it in. Did the judge indicate any meanings during? Okay.
She did.
Did she give a timeline for when we can expect a ruling?
No. And I will say, you mentioned the messages he sent to the girls. They indicated that they don't have the actual messages. They have something to the effect, some sort of digital footprint that indicates
like
messages.
A hash. A hash something, yeah.
Yeah, they don't actually.
I think that happens when it's encrypted, something like that, where maybe the messages can auto-delete, but it's like almost a digital footprint that it happened, right? Something like that.
I think they didn't bring in Klein earlier because I think they were scared that he did know him. That's total speculation, but that is my speculation. These two men were the same age and the same general area growing up together. I think there was concern from the defense team of that's a little close, but there seems to be no evidence that they really were in close communication or anything.
A key problem with the Odinist they want to tie to the murders is that he has a very good alibi for the time that the police say the murders occurred. And so because of that, the defense wants to suggest, well, actually, the girls were killed much, much later. So in order to combat that, the prosecutor had an expert come in who works with the Internet Crimes Against Children unit. And he talked about his examination of Libby German's phone. And that indicated to him he was able to prove what time the famous video we've all seen, Guys Down the Hill, what time that was taken. It was taken at 2:13. And he provided some more detail that Apple Health's data was on the watch, or of the phone, rather. And this data tells when a phone moves. Now, it doesn't tell if you're in a vehicle, but it tells if a person is walking and moving. And this was some new information. It revealed that the phone traveled to the location roughly where the girls were discovered, and then it did not move anymore after 2:32 p.m.
Mm.
Man,
powerful.
those numbers always, yeah.
They're yeah. We saw that in Murdaugh too, which brings us to another kind of assertion that we've heard out about this case, and that's that the girls couldn't have been killed there, that they were taken away and then brought back at some point. I think you guys reported on a lot of testimony that seemed to cut against that. I think it's worth bringing out here because there's been so much misinformation in this case, and it's when you're under oath in a hearing before a judge that a lot of this is cleared up and you don't just have one side filing a 120-page Frank's motion. So what kind of was that gotten into at all with respect to the scene or any sort of transporting? There's the digital footprint, which I think is very powerful.
That was gotten into in, frankly, upsetting detail. And family members were there and they heard some awful things. There was an expert named Pat Cicero, who's actually a real expert who does this for a living. He has been in crime scene analysis for, I think, 20 some years. And he actually he got all the autopsy pictures, he got crime scene pictures, he got all the police reports. He went to the scene and he did testing there. And he was able to determine, I believe there were 2 pools of blood at the crime scene. 3 pools of blood where the girls were discovered. He indicated that Abby's clothing that she was wearing was so saturated with blood that it was clear that after she received her injuries, she did not move, and that she died where she received her wounds.
They were not moved. I mean, the blood evidence was pretty compelling. There was blood everywhere. Now, one thing he mentioned is that in some of the photos, which unfortunately were leaked, we're talking about February in Indiana, there's leaves all over the ground. It's not the easiest crime scene in order to see everything, if that makes sense. But the amount of blood at the scene would strongly, I mean, they were killed right there. The blood is all there. There was not, you hear about cases where the lack of blood makes it clear that the body was moved and the killing was done elsewhere. This is not one of those cases.
That was part of the sort of disinformation campaign online, that there was no blood, and that proves that they had to have been killed somewhere.
Let me just say with that, because I'm so glad you brought that up, Brett. There are people in this case who have not only just, basically formed an opinion without really hearing anything. They've actually gone out of their way to spread disinformation, misinformation, and lie to people in order to sway public opinion. Why you would do this with your life, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to say for people who are doing it and for people who are aiding and abetting with it, people see what you're doing at this point. People know, and we're going to definitely try to make sure that hangs around your neck for the rest of, your commentary life. But I'm going to say this, all they can do is make stuff up. They can't actually engage with any of the facts coming up. So they just have to confuse everyone with a bunch of nonsense. And it's getting to a point, I think people are sick of it.
It's twofold. Anya, you're so nice. You said, I don't know why they would do this. It's to try to say that the body was moved. But number 2, if there's not a lot of blood on the scene, then you can import meaning to blood as ruins or signs, when that's the image that I've had because of all the information online that is now being shown to be completely incorrect. I can imagine if you see, for example, red blood marks that say an X and there's no other blood around. Whoa, that really stands out. That's a very different situation than if there's blood all over this entire room and maybe I can make out that there's some X right there, but who knows, because there's so much blood, it's soaking through everything. That's a very different, and I don't mean to be graphic, but that is a very different message. And the reason you want to be able to say you see things clearly is because of the ritualistic angle, right? And that seems very, very misleading. But it sounds like that was not the scene whatsoever.
No, there was this tree that had some sort of, defense argued that it was a symbol on the tree in blood of one of the victims. And this gentleman was able to demonstrate pretty clearly it was actually largely blood transferred directly from the hand of Libby German as she was dying.
She put her hand on the tree. Gosh. Yeah, it's awful. People were crying. I mean, it was one of those things. It was awful. And we won't get into the details here, but it was just one of those things. We actually learned more about what those girls' last moments were like. And it was horrible. It was just a horrible, horrible thing. Richard Allen's sitting there in front of us fidgeting. His family at this point had left the room. Andrew Baldwin had come up to them before this witness, and there was some discussion. They were gone, and they just left at that point because, who knows? But it was one of those things where it was hard to hear, but that witness was very powerful. He had a lot to say, and he really did even further damage to this Odinist ritual idea, because he was able to say that if you try painting on a tree with all these furrows and its bark, it's not canvas, with blood, it is very difficult to get that same symbol. But if your hands are covered in blood and you do it, you can see it pretty easily happening. So what he had to say was very compelling.
And I just want to know, for everyone hearing all this testimony, we've said this a lot of times, that the prosecution hasn't told its story, right? There's been a gag order. There hasn't been a trial. You still aren't hearing the full story. We are hearing devastating rebuttals to a lot of baseless claims that have been part of the defense's strategy thus far. The prosecution is doing the right thing in that they're presenting rebuttal witnesses, but you're not hearing the prosecution's entire case. I point that out because don't treat these 3 hearings as the trial. They are simply responding to what is being alleged. It really sounds like spaghetti at the wall.
Yes.
But the fact that they can have these powerful witnesses and they don't want to, based on what's happened so far, they don't want to try this in the media. They haven't been trying to leak out information about the amount of blood and countering all the misinformation that is out there. So we had said all along, wait till you hear the whole case. We're seeing parts of it already, but remember, this isn't even the prosecution's whole case. But if it's already this strong just in rebutting the baseless and misinformation, then it heartens me for what they have for trial purposes.
And let me just say this. I've been critical of the defense team at times. I don't think they always have Richard Allen's best interest at heart. But I think it's important to separate the defense team from the jokers on Twitter, right? Because the defense team, well, let me make my statement. The defense team, it's their job to defend Richard Allen. And it's their job to be creative in the arguments they make. When they're talking about the BAU, they're very creative in how they describe that in their Frank's motion. The people on Twitter who are not his lawyers, who are not his advocates, who call themselves sleuths, who are just disinformation agents who lie to people regularly, they are a cancer in this case and in the judicial system. The defense team has to do what they have to do to defend him. But just today, in this 3-day hearing, we already have a list of things that many of us have been told from people who should know better that are just lies. The BAU did not say this was a ritualistic killing. Detective Click didn't say this was a ritualistic killing. The lack of blood thing was a complete lie. The notion that the prosecution wasn't turning over discovery is a lie. These are just lies, and they're being spread by people who have no interest in the truth and who aren't even his defense attorneys. I mean, I don't know. It blows my mind that this much was uncovered in such a short period of time. And like Al said, if we have a trial, the amount of disinformation that's going to be uncovered that has been part of this media plan, this media scheme to confuse people, to con people, frankly, into giving their money to support a confessed child killer. People gave their hard-earned money to support this man. If you want to support the defense of the indigent, there are lots of charities I can point you to for public defenders and federal defenders. They need that money. They put it to good use. Do not give your money to Richard Allen. I mean, it blows my mind. It just blows my mind. And I can barely even stomach this case anymore because of just how disgusting it's gotten.
Brett, I think I mostly agreed with pretty much all of that, so I apologize. But one thing I disagree with. So this is something that we uncovered pretty recently, was texts between internet cranks, YouTubers, and Matt Hoffman, who was sitting up there with the defense. He's their prime investigator. He's their lead investigator, talking with them and telling them about how he thinks that the judge is against the defense because she must be being blackmailed. And that, what was the other crazy thing he said?
Their
You
lives
know, they
were
have
at risk.
their lives. Our lives are at risk. Our lives are at risk. The Odinists basically, I guess, presumably, are going to come for them. And in addition to that, the prosecution has nothing. His big fear in the case is that the prosecution will just plant evidence and make stuff up. That's his big fear. So you have people on the defense team leaking to YouTubers, trying to get them riled up with misinformation of their own, trying to get them to spread and disseminate that misinformation. So either this defense team, the lawyers themselves, are completely clueless about what's going on under their noses with their trusted private investigator, who apparently is actually an in-office assistant technically, but they're calling him an investigator. Either they're completely clueless and they're running the leakiest ship in the world, or this is part of the plan, and the plan is just basically, I mean, we've seen this again and again in some of their allies and, you know, people who are associated with the team like Carol Weinecke and whatnot, talking about how the goal is to put out so much crap that they get a hung jury because one juror believes in the conspiracy. Or you know, there was statements made about like, we're going to make this case so unpopular to try that Nick McClelland's going to have to fold. You know, we're going to storm the Bastille and free Richard Allen. You know, the people are going to come together and gather at the barricades, essentially. I think that is a somewhat delusional strategy at this point. But I do think that the calls are coming from inside the house to a certain extent, whether that's through complete negligence or whatnot. I'm like, we work with people, right? Like, you know, like we have a wonderful moderator for our Facebook group. If she turned around and was like, you know, like doing all this stuff, like that comes back to rest on us because she's part of our team. Right. Like, so even if it's not like us doing it, I think we bear some responsibility. Right. I think they bear responsibility for what their investigators doing. And I'm going to tell you this, in the messages we reviewed, these cranks talked openly about meeting with Brad and Andy and talking with Brad and Andy. So maybe they're lying to get clout. I think that's always possible. But I mean, I've seen the text between them and the investigator, so they certainly weren't lying about that.
And let me just say, the work you guys have been doing is incredible. If those of you out there listening have not been listening to the murder sheet, and they're, I mean, diving into the sewer, basically. I mean, you guys, you're like the triathletes,
yes.
the triathletes in Paris, and y'all are swimming in the hoop field.
Hope you're not throwing up at the end, though. You might be. I'm sorry.
Sounds like you're describing our office.
I feel like swimming in the sewer seems horribly like on brand for us. Like, but no, we really appreciate that. And no, but the thing is, people also, I mean, everyone here is listening to you, obviously, but like one thing we always recommend is that people listen to you because you bring that analysis to it that's just really incredible. Kind of this like, what does the law actually say? I know you made a joke about that earlier, Brett, but like people forget, people forget what the law actually says. And like the law does matter quite a lot here. You can't just do whatever, you know, they can't just freestyle this trial. There's rules.
And there was a moment when I was standing in line waiting to go in, and I was looking at my phone. I got a text from our mutual friend, Jason Blair. He happened to be saying something about how great Brett and Alice are. And literally the same time I was reading that text, Susan Hendricks, standing behind me, starts talking about how great Brett and Alice are. So you guys are really loved out here.
Yeah, people really appreciate what you're doing. I know I've heard from so many people. I mean, Delphi is a community under siege. These internet cranks have basically determined that it's the most corrupt place on earth. Everyone there is a mustache twirling villain who is just doing all sorts of dastardly deeds. And they're the only ones who can fight the corruption. So people there have been under siege, even on a local level, just people who are not really affiliated with the case. It's like a very almost like traumatized community in a way. And we always hear people appreciating what you're doing, which is injecting some truth and clarity and just like, what does the law say? Is this based on anything? So you guys are doing really excellent work. And we just want to say thank you for that, because I feel like you're a beacon in the darkness.
I think that is absolutely mutual. And thank you for bringing that up, humanizing all of this. You guys got to sit in that courtroom and listen to devastating testimony that nobody wants to hear. Literally no one, right? Richard Allen's own family left for the most devastating parts that we don't even know the whole story of what happened to the girls. And that will be God hope, if this has to come out in trial, that their family is taken care of during that, because I know that they'd want to stay away from it. But I had hoped that after the Karen Reed fiasco, that people would recognize that these conspiracy theories that people spin for enjoyment is all I can imagine for, I don't know, entertainment, have real impacts on real people's lives. We are talking about entire towns. We're talking about Judge Gull being called really wretched names. She is a real human being who has been given the job to sit on this case. I don't think that she picked it, and she has, continued to do her job. There are attorneys in this case. There are witnesses in this case. There are experts in this case. Everyone who's being pulled into this is feeling the weight of this case, and many of them don't belong in this case. And those who are spreading disinformation about it, who are consuming disinformation despite all of the evidence, quite literally under testimony, undercutting that misinformation, if you continue to consume it, then you are perpetuating that problem. And these ramifications will go beyond Delphi. They will go beyond Richard Allen's case. They will go beyond this case. It affects our entire judicial system. It affects other victims' families, other criminal defendants. Just keep that in mind. That's why I think we both do what we do. That's why your reporting is so important. I had noted before we even started recording, in preparation for today, I was trying to read articles about what happened, and it was really difficult to understand what was happening in the courtroom, because all I saw all over the place was, doesn't matter, defense had an expert. Odinism, it definitely was. That was it, because it's a headline. It's very interesting, but there was no discussion of who testified, what was happening in court. And the only place I've really been able to hear that is from you guys. So I appreciate your reporting. It's exhausting. I know you've woken up at 4 a.m. for days on end. You stand in line. You skip lunch because you're so emotionally invested in all of these things, just so that you can do honest reporting when you get out of the courtroom. I usually just want to faceplant into a couch, but instead you guys turn around, you go on TV, you record shows, you come on our show so generously. So thank you for doing that. And please continue, everyone, as you hear these things, don't be part of the misinformation spread. Know that this is not entertainment. This is real lives. This is playing out before our eyes. And this is the exact reason, by the way, the judge hasn't allowed cameras in the courtroom. I mean, this is truly
absolutely.
the reason.
Yeah.
If you want to know why, it's because of misinformation like this. It will only be exponentiated because the attorneys, the witnesses, the experts, etc., are all of a sudden on a national stage, and the harassment level, if you think it's bad now, would be so much more. So while I want to be able to hear and see what's going on, for the sake of this case and the insanity surrounding the case, I think it's the right decision to keep cameras out of the courtroom, despite usually not being in favor of that. So sorry for that rant, but I just wanted to note that this is truly one of the most misinformation cases I've ever seen. And misinformation cannot thrive without oxygen. And oxygen is everyone who clicks and listens to it. So consumerism is what drives it.
And you mentioned Jason Blair. I know he was on your show recently talking about some of these issues. We were just on his show talking about this bigger picture of ethics and true crime. And I think it cannot be overstated how important the work you're doing that Alice just pointed out. We mentioned the satanic panic earlier. It is amazing how we look back at things like that and we laugh at it and we say to ourselves, how did those people ever fall for that? I can't believe they thought that every day care had secret tunnels underneath it where they were sacrificing children to their dark gods. Ha ha ha. And then we see Delphi and we see exactly how it happens. And we see, as Alice said, the mainstream media, the newspapers, the internet running with this and just believing, because you put the word expert in front of a witness, all of a sudden you believe what she says when she talks about textbook ritualistic killings, as if there are enough ritualistic killings to have a textbook. There are not. I would like her to point out to me what all the ritualistic killings in her textbook are, because they don't happen. And it is so important for you guys to be able to bring this message to all of us, because we have to push back on this. It is a dark, dark, dark chasm that we will fall down into if we let this stuff take over.
Brett, so
thank
well
you,
said.
thank you so much for those words and for having us on. I'm sorry. I feel like we've just been getting
ranting.
I always apologize for ranting for like 2 minutes. I feel we ranted for like 90 minutes.
You'll ask us like, what about Odinism? We'll be like, bah! Primal scream.
So apologize for that, and thank you so much for your patience with us.
Yeah, and I just want to, what both of you said was amazing about true crime. Like, I think the people who listen to you and the people who listen to us, I think there's overlap there. But I think a lot of people, true crime might have an entertaining value for them, but it also is a place to be informed and to kind of learn about things, learn about how the law works, learn about how investigations work, and criminology. There's a real good side to it, and this is what Jason often says, like there's this bright side to it. But if people who are sane and acting in good faith cede the ground to the people who are using this to work out some issues and who are basically harassing and going after victims' families, and by the one thing I wonder though, we mentioned Kagan Klein as a possible escape route for this defense team. Based on stuff that we saw in messages and whatnot, I also wonder if the move is going to be to go after the victims' families as well, or if that's going to be somehow. And like that, that's a disturbing possibility, but it seems like one that is currently on the table. And I'm just going to say this, like, we have to kind of hold firm with this stuff and like accept that there should be certain standards and certain lines that we do not cross when we're in this space, and not treating it completely like entertainment, having boundaries and not doing harmful and abusive behavior just because we think we're right is so important. And that's why I'm so glad we're all having these kind of conversations, because I think they resonate with a lot of people. I think most people just want to be normal and like not be awful online, but it's a small group that's very loud and very engaged that is driving a lot of these problems. And I think if we can all, even if people are in disagreement with opinions on cases, that really doesn't matter as much as behavior. And we need to look at who is behaving in a way where they are lying, abusing others, harassing, stalking, doxing, and that's where we need to kind of draw the line around them and say, not in our community, this is not acceptable.
Absolutely. So after these, that's also well said, and it's so good to have that overarching perspective, bringing back to these 3 hearings that you guys so diligently sat through. What's going to happen next is the judge will rule. Trial is currently still set for October. Like Brett said, though, the way the evidence seemed to have come out based on y'all's reporting, the Odinism theory should not be allowed in. The motion to compel seems like it's going nowhere. And so it seems like there should be a lot of pretty devastating rulings for the defense. And in any typical case with those sorts of blows, the defense changes tactics in terms of perhaps seeking a guilty plea. So a lot can happen between now and whenever the judge rules and then trial. And I have no doubt that you guys will do wonderful reporting. If you guys have not been listening to the Murder Sheet, you must hop over there and listen to their incredible reporting, not just on this case. They do incredible reporting across the board. We are so thankful for you guys for coming on. We know we've kept you for so long. You've been awake for 182 hours. We're going on 183. Before we let you guys go, though, is there anything else from these 3 days of hearings that you'd like to let people know, since we couldn't be in the room?
For that, while I thought, especially Brad Rosie, one of the defense attorneys, had some good moments, this overall has been a rout for the defense team. They had an opportunity to give us a mini trial where they were essentially talking about, give us the sales pitch for the Odinism theory, wow us. And perhaps I'm naive because I've often been quite critical of the Odinist theory as weak, but I thought we would be getting a little bit of new information, at least to give the press something to chew on. And instead we got the same old thing, maybe a few new witnesses, which was interesting, but not nearly enough. And this was a devastating series of hearings for them. The one thing they did succeed on was they got Alan transferred from Wabash Valley, which is a prison, to Cass County. So he walked out, this all ended kind of on this dramatic note where he walks out smiling with these deputies, and he's remanded to the custody of the Carroll County Sheriff to be brought to Cass County. So there's a bit of a victory for him and them there. But other than that, it was a rout.
I would agree with that. A small preview of coming attractions, which may not lead anywhere. When the hearing was almost over, the judge called all the attorneys to the bench, and they had what very clearly was a very heated exchange amongst each other. And she said, well, we don't have time to deal with this now. We'll have to talk about it next week.
So we don't know what that means. If there's going to be, I don't know if there's going to be another hearing or some sort of in-chambers discussion, but it seems like something is still unsettled in this whole thing. And we are so intrigued, but they were far away and nobody heard them, but we were just like, to be a fly on that bench and figure out what the heck they were all. I mean, Brad Rosie at one point kind of stood back and was looking very outraged. So I don't know what's going on. Can I ask you guys a question, if that's okay?
Sure.
Anytime.
What do you think is going to happen with any of this? Like, do you think, based on what you've heard so far, are you thinking the move is, let's go with the Klein angle? Do you think the move is, let's try desperately to work out some kind of plea deal? What are your thoughts?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll say, well, first of all, in your hearings, we sort of addressed this a little bit, but you got your confessions. For those of you who don't know, we kept saying this, but just to explain exactly what it means, there's admissibility, which is a legal question, and there's weight. Weight is a factual question. Admissibility is a really high bar to kick out the confession, so I think that will fail probably on all of these confessions. Now, later on, the defense, once the confessions come in, will be able to argue all the things that they argued today to say, hey, jury, don't give these confessions much weight because, he was locked up in solitary and he didn't know what he was saying, all that stuff. But I think she will not exclude any of that. Their best case is she asks for additional briefing to actually explain their reasoning for each confession. And then on the third party, I don't think she'll let the Odinism stuff in, but that's judge to judge, right? She may have a pretty low bar for third party liability stuff. So maybe she does let it in. I do think the Keegan Klein stuff will come in. Once all that happens, and then you're very much now in the light of day about what's going to happen at trial. And I think that anyone else, would be advising him, let's try and get the best deal we can get. And look, there's a couple different reasons to plead guilty. One of them is you can get some sort of actual benefit. To my understanding, death penalty is not on the table, so you can't take that off. I'm not sure exactly what the prosecution can give, if anything. So maybe that's a problem in this case. There's just not much they can give. But that's only one reason to plead guilty. The other reason, which people just ignore, it blows my mind, is you want to make amends. You want to start living the rest of your life by admitting what you did, kind of like what it seemed like he wanted to do in April of 2023. And he still has
ties in this case, right? Like, he has a daughter, he has a wife who he literally made overtures to please love me, continue to love me, and a mother. Like, this is not someone who is completely isolated in the world. He's like, whatever, like, do what you will with me. I have no other ties, right? Like, he's a young person in the sense that he's not old, he's not on death's doorstep, and he could have a lot of people who are part of his life, who care about him, who will be massively impacted if this goes to trial and they hear about everything that he did.
And I don't want to speculate too much about this because it would just be pure speculation. But a lot of people have said, and it's not a crazy thing to say, that you probably don't just go from being the manager at the CVS to brutally murdering two girls. It happens. People are wrong when they say it never happens. It does. But it could be that there are other things in his past that the prosecution may know about that he also may not want to come out. So we just don't know enough about that to know what his motivations may be. But it seems like, at least at one time, he wanted to confess, plead guilty, and end this. Whether that has changed, I don't know. It's going to be, just based on these 3 days, it's going to be a brutal trial for the defense if they go. It's just, they're going to, those 61 confessions, every single one of them, they're going to play them. There's going to be
one at a time.
As many. Yeah. It's just going to be a wipeout. And
I would support that.
Absolutely.
I would not argue that it's cumulative because of each situation is different. He probably has different information about each. We've talked about this in like character witnesses where it's cumulative. You're just talking about how Leo Schofield is an abusive person over and over. This is not. This is directly on point. And so as the prosecution, I would probably start with about, I would start with the crime scene, and then I would probably go into 61, maybe break it up, maybe do 20, and then have a forensic expert, and then another 20, and then another forensic expert, and then another 20, and then a forensic expert, and then end with this most devastating one. I mean, I don't know how you survive and walk out of the courtroom each day like that. I mean, that is truly, and that is not making up a playbook. That is just the evidence that the defense has handed to you. And I absolutely think they should be admissible. Argue all day long how, it's Odinist, or he can't argue his Odinist cards all day long that he's under duress and that he hasn't eaten in days and he's scared for his life and he's in solitude. Sure, all day long. 61 times is a lot. One time, maybe. 61 is a very different story.
And we're not even talking about the fact that he put himself there.
Literally put himself there.
He just moved on from the actual evidence in the case.
The evidence that led everyone to him, right? And we haven't even talked about ballistics. I think it's very telling that this pretrial hearing did not involve an expert challenging the ballistic markings on the bullet, and there was no Daubert motion, no Daubert hearing. That blows my mind that was not part of their pretrial filings, because that is an actual legal basis. My understanding is that is based on NIBIN experts. This is kind of a newish way of tying a ballistic to the gun without it actually being fired. There's a lot to say there. And when you get technical and you have good technical experts, juries perk up, because it's like, okay, we're not just talking about like he said, she said, Odinism and whatnot. We're talking about literal technology and whether you can match these markings. I think it's very telling that was not part of the pretrial hearings. Sorry, we've gone off from your question, but all to say is 99.99999% of defense attorneys, if those confessions are let in, is going to be pursuing any plea deal. I don't care if death is not on the table. It's going to be too devastating to go to trial. You advise your client to plead. This case, I really don't know. I really don't know. I hope that if Richard Allen is not pleading, it's because he's been presented his options and he has chosen himself not to do that. But remember, you can always plead until the jury comes back. It is an option to you, Richard Allen. That is something that is available to you, and no one can keep you from doing that. And all you have to do is quite literally raise your hand to do it. And there's no too far gone into a trial to not plead. So I think, I don't know. I mean, it'll be very interesting because the next motion after is going to be whether this trial date sticks. Oftentimes you will see after a pretrial ruling, some side may try to move the trial date based on whatever happens in court. Oh, we need to retrigger. Usually you see this like in a Daubert. A Daubert motion is filed against an expert gets kicked out, and then in a pretrial motion, and then the defense or whoever's expert will say, well, we need to find a new expert or something like that.
If the Odinism gets kicked out.
Yeah.
That's what
maybe that was our expert. So now we have to do now you're letting us do Klein. Well, we hadn't investigated Klein because we thought it was going to be Odinism. So now we have to investigate that. So it'll be interesting what the defense does afterwards, because my understanding is the prosecution is not looking to delay the trial, and they shouldn't. If I were the prosecution, you always want to go right away. We talked about this. It's already been delayed long enough. They are not doing a campaign in the media. The defense seems to be doing so, and witnesses' memories fade. So they want to go to trial as soon as possible, which is so interesting because everyone's like, the defense is all here for speedy trial. So far, if you look at the actions, it is the prosecution who is trying to be holding the trial date steady. And
just so we're clear, I was being sarcastic earlier. Just so this is very clear, that was a lie as well. They lied to you about the speedy trial.
They were
never ready. No. Not last year, not in January. They were never ready.
Not today.
Not today, yeah.
And I say not today because of exactly what I said. They need a ballistic expert. And I think they plan to have one. The fact that they don't have one right now, that's why I'm saying they're not ready. It's not casting dispersions on whatever they happened the last 3 days. I'm saying look at their filings. They are not ready for trial. If I'm going to trial in October and I am them, I am soiling myself because I'm like, wow, I have done nothing on my checklist of what needs to be done before we go to trial. So that is an objective statement. That is not meant to say they didn't do well in the last 3 days. Whatever they did in the last 3 days, who cares? It's what they haven't filed and what they haven't prepared for purposes of trial, which is why I don't think they're ready for trial today. very long way. I said I was going to let you guys go. Now we're going on to like 185 hours of you guys being awake. But
we slept until noon today, or at least I did. You got me
No,
we pick up our dog, but I was just sleeping. So
poor dog.
I know she's great. We say she's our executive producer, but honestly, I sometimes think she stays at this place and she loves it there. She gets all excited and it's kind of embarrassing because then when she gets out, I'm sure she's like, oh, I have to go back to their house with all these friggin' bookshelves where they like talk into microphones. I think she was in here earlier, like spying on us, but now she's like, I'm going to bed.
Well, we truly thank you guys. You guys, you have to listen to The Murder Sheet. You can find them anywhere you get podcasts. And Kevin, Anya, thank you for joining us today. It is always a joy to hear from you guys. And we know the reporting you've been doing is quite literally changing the course of the misinformation that's happening. We've already seen the effects of it. So thank you for what you do.
That means a lot. Thank you so much, guys.
Well, guys, until next time, it's not going to be as exciting as this one, but Brett and I will try to come up with something. Until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
I'm Anya.
And I'm Kevin.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
I think the person who originally put together superlatives is no longer a fan because I had to make a copy of the original thing
to
do it. So I feel like they locked us out or something. It must have been an admin person. I'm not sure.
It's a lot to keep up with. I'm not gonna lie.
It is.
We're gonna leave in the laughing because that's so cute.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys.
So
I'm sorry. We
us.
always keep you so late.
I know.
I feel
people in the chat. I got to end the stream so we can download the recordings, but you guys are awesome too.
Yes.
Thank you
and
all.
We'll see y'all soon.